Fraser McCluskey, Parachute Padre, is that throughout years of my own ministry, Fraser has been a well-known name, and as we'll perhaps touch on later on, an example to the ministry of others. So, on behalf of St. Columbas, welcome. Many of you, I think, have been here this morning. We've had a pretty amazing pipe bands and everyone else included morning, a delicious lunch, but a special welcome to any who are just joining us for the afternoon talk. Before we get underway, also to say that we are absolutely delighted that we're joined today by the Reverend Andrew McCluskey, one of Fraser's two sons, along with Joe and Howard and Emily, family members of the McCluskey of the McCluskey clan. And at the conclusion of the talk, I hope there'll be an opportunity perhaps to ask questions to Andrew, and we may, if he wishes, may speak to us a little bit as well. So, without further ado, at the outbreak of war, the Reverend Fraser McCluskey, an ordained minister of the Church of Scotland, was chaplain at Glasgow University, wrestling with how best to make his contribution to the war effort. He considered whether it was right or appropriate or better either to serve as a fighting man, to bear arms, or to serve as a non-combatant, as a padre. His wife Irene was a German pastor's daughter, and so during his time spent in Nazi Germany, he had witnessed firsthand how Hitler's extreme anti-Semitic political ideology had spread among the people like a deadly disease. As he considered the decisions he was to make, a pre-war conversation with his own parish minister had suggested to him important words. You might like to think that you had shared the burden and heat of the day with your friends. In 1942, Fraser joined the British Army as a chaplain. Initial chaplaincy training was at Tidworth in Wiltshire, an army camp still of today. After the war, Fraser himself would be in charge of training new chaplains. But as he said, that is another story. Though fewer in number and without the incentives of war, new boys still arrive at chaplaincy training and still find, I hope, as I did, a kindly introduction to a very big job.
Fraser's first posting. I discovered what a soulless business it is being a chaplain on a strictly denominational basis to about 50 different units of every type and description, scattered throughout one's district. How very exacting it was, how exhausting and depressing, and at times, how rewarding. Here I learned that it is sometimes as difficult for a padre to find a real welcome in a static formation as it is easy in a fighting unit in the field. Here I saw the contribution that all sorts of undistinguished men and women were making in army offices, stores, garages, hospitals, salvage dumps, pioneer units, and 101 other services without which the army could not exist for one day. Here I watched fresh intakes at the training centres and saw civilians of varying shapes and sizes and ages becoming soldiers. If there were difficulties, because one was a visiting chaplain and nowhere had a real home, then by contrast, the camps and units which took on one as a padre, and as their padre to their hearts gave, all the greater joy. Maybe I had to assure myself rather too often that the South Bink sub-district was an excellent place for me to begin, but to learn to take the rough with the smooth is not a bad introduction to the army, or to any other kind of life.
With mixed fortunes in his initial posting, Fraser took up the news that the army, and particularly the chaplains department, was seeking parachute-trained chaplains. Damien, in his book SAS Daggers Drawn, describes Fraser as a ham-fisted jumper. The Padre learned how to parachute at the Central Landing School at RAF Ringway, now the location of Manchester Airport. Prior to jumps training, we reached camp, I remember, on a Saturday afternoon and found ourselves with nothing to do except contemplate the horrors and tortures which in the popular imagination constituted the necessary preparation for parachuting. It started snowing, and although the countryside under these conditions did not look particularly inviting, I went out for a walk with an officer I had met as we travelled down from Chesterfield. I think we both felt a guilty feeling that, snow or no snow, we ought to be doing something to get or keep fit. Through the falling snow and gathering darkness, we could discern the shape of things to come, and shapes of a disquieting nature at that. Ropes dangled invitingly, or to be more accurate, uninvitingly, over very unfriendly cliff faces. Gaunt steel erections stood around looking grim. The usual battle courses were there with various unusual obstacles to add to their interest. We came to the conclusion that this course, whatever its merits or demerits, would not be dull.
Synthetic training finished on a Saturday, and weather permitting, we would do our first balloon jump on the Monday morning at the horrible hour of 7 a.m. On Sunday afternoon, I sat in the Ringway mess writing home. I was very, very scared. Not so much of an accident happening, because I had thought all about that and was prepared to take the risk. I was scared of myself, afraid of being a coward, more afraid of letting myself and everyone else down than being killed. I don't suppose I was the only member of my course who slept less soundly than usual on that Sunday night, but even the soundest sleepers were up in good time on Monday morning. We loaded ourselves into buses that had, to my imagination, a distinctly hearse-like appearance, and off we went to Tatton Park, where in the cold light of dawn we saw the lorries with their winches and the balloons floating above. First of all, the instructors climbed into the balloon cages and went up to do a demonstration jump. Out they came, hurtling from the holes in the center of the cages. And then it happened. The parachutes opened. And for the first time in my life, I watched men floating down to earth. So that was what we were about to do. Damien Lewis added, each time Fraser stepped to the exit, the wind whipping him in his face, he would place his false teeth in his pocket for safekeeping.
Having qualified as a jumps-trained chaplain, in good army fashion, there were no vacancies in the parachute regiments. Instead, Fraser was posted to Darvel in Ayrshire, there to report to a new unit of which very little was known. The SAS were in part recuperating from the Italian campaign, and in part preparing for operating behind the lines in occupied France. After a long train journey, the new Padre arrived at breakfast time to discover what looked like an all-nighter in the mess.
The front door was open, and I wondered if I myself were too early for breakfast. Hoping for the best, I advanced into the hall. A strange and somewhat confused sight met my eye. Officers were passing through the hall into the dining room to the strains of a small and exceedingly wheezy gramophone, playing Mush Mush Sing Tura Ai Ali. Around the fireplace, in the ashes of a dead fire, and oblivious both of the breakfast procession and the orchestral accompaniment, sat several officers in varying attitudes of repose. From this somnolent party, a large man, a very large man, detached himself on my entry and heaved himself in my direction. If he didn't actually ask who the devil I was and what the devil was I doing there, I gathered, at least that was at the back of his mind, he seemed to be someone in authority, for I observed even in my own bleary-eyed and breakfastless condition that he was a lieutenant colonel. I announced that I was the new Padre, and waited in vain for any light to break upon his countenance. I gathered that the 1st Special Air Service Regiment had not expected a Padre, that the brigade authorities had not informed them of a Padre's coming, that this was what one would expect a brigade, and that the whole business was obviously most irregular. However, this particular lieutenant colonel, who with every passing minute was making me feel that when I last was weighed and measured, a mistake must have been made somewhere, was obviously a fair-minded man, rightly or wrongly, and more probably wrongly. I should remove my hat and come and have breakfast. I was reminded in the mess that indeed I should remove my hat, and so it was. My inquisitor rejoined the bodies, whether alive or dead I could not have told, around the fireplace, and I gladly accepted the invitation. It does not take long to sense the atmosphere of a strange mess. In some, the stranger is simply frozen. In this particular mess, I had hardly sat down before I felt completely at home. And before I had finished the meal, I had made up my mind that if this particular unit would have me, then this is where I would stay.
Part of Fraser's integration with his new unit was obviously based around the training that they undertook together. But as was already indicated, it was clearly a social mess. During the intensive period of preparation, there were moments of relaxation. There were occasional passes for an evening trip to Glasgow, parties in the mess, boisterous and noisy, which helped to let off steam, but also cemented relationships. Old and new, irrespective of rank, became comfortable with each other, confident that they'd all accepted the hidden disciplines that were part of the unique regimental spirit. One description that I used to share with new chaplains who I was involved with the training of was this description of Fraser in his unit. As the beer flowed, the songs got louder, while our Church of Scotland Padre, the Reverend Fraser McCluskey, serenely played the piano, occasionally wiping spilled beer from the keys with his handkerchief. It was a bit of a shock to the newcomers to discover that the regiment's favourite song was Lily Marlene, so loved by the Germans, but now legitimised with the regiment's own words. When loud songs turned to lewd songs, the Padre would just stand up from the piano and turn to the Colonel. "Permission to withdraw, sir." To which the answer was always, "Certainly, Padre. Good night." And to a resounding chorus of, "Good night, Padre," from momentarily sobered members of the mess, he went up to his bed. In June 1944, shortly before and shortly after the D-Day landings, Fraser made his first operational jump with one SAS.
This is a description of Fraser's parachute descent into occupied France. The light flashed red and then green. Almost before it changed, Roy Bradford was out and number 2 followed. One by one, we shuffled up to the patch of grey that was the exit hole. I must be near it now, I thought, and at that moment, Hamish hurtled down at my feet. Heaving my kit bag up, I jumped. I was vaguely conscious of a form beneath me and of the smack of his static line against the hole. But by that time, I was out, falling, whipped by the wind and hanging on like grim death with the kit bag on my leg. With a jerk, I found myself twisting and turning with my chute spread wide above me. Below me, I could see only a blurred blackness. I grabbed for the quick release, and as carefully as I could, paid out the rope attached to the kit bag. I mustn't lose that. And then I looked down again. I was coming down over a thick forest. and wherever I landed, I should almost certainly hit a tree. I wasn't far off them now, by the look of things. I braced myself for hitting something and gave my head and face all the protection I could. The kit bag swinging beneath me went crashing through thick branches, and almost simultaneously I followed suit. I was down. Or was I? All I knew was that I felt acutely uncomfortable. I discovered that I was hanging upside down, suspended by one leg from the branch of a tree, whether large or small I could not say. All I could say was that the leg by which I was suspended was hurting like blazes. I was caught up in some tangled fashion in my parachute harness, and remember my knife, shoved into my smock at the last moment, and easily accessible. I got it out with no difficulty and started hacking at the harness. And there I ceased to take any further interest in events. What happened exactly, I shall never know. Either I cut away in the only strap which attached me to the branch, or else my not inconsiderable weight brought the branch down with me. But whatever happened, I fell, and fell to some purpose. My last recollection is of crashing head first through innumerable branches. I knew no more until I wakened up on a soft, grassy bank at the foot of the tree, being violently and noisily sick. Memory slowly returned. The flight, the jump, the crash landing, the suspension on the branch, the fall. I saw from my watch I had been unconscious for about 40 minutes. I was in France then, and my landing on French soil might have been heard 50 kilometers away. I was lucky not to have broken my neck, although how far I'd fallen it was too dark to see. One good thing: my precious kit bag lay at my side, smothered in some branches that had somehow accompanied my descent. I couldn't find the knife anywhere. It was a perfectly good jackknife, as well as a kid glove to the bad. This wasn't my lucky night. Or perhaps it was. I was still in one piece anyway. Meantime, it was black as pitch, and I appeared to be in the densest concentration of trees on the continent. It was nearly 3 a.m., and all was quiet. I decided I'd done enough damage for one night, and propping myself up against my precious kit bag, I dozed off to sleep. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I woke myself up, being sick again. My innards were protesting against their violent treatment. I was sick intermittently until the middle of the morning, and I was all right again. Dawn was breaking, and I was able to inspect my new environment a little more closely. I was lying at the foot of a tree which had acted as my reception committee, and for the first time I saw just how far I'd fallen. It was about 40 feet high, and from the position of my parachute strapping, I'd been perched pretty well at the top. My parachute still billowed in the breeze above it, but another look at the tree was sufficient to show that there wasn't a hope of ever getting it down. Even the maquis, experts in collecting parachutes, had to admit failure at a later stage. At this point, I heard a whistle, a quite unmistakable whistle. Aha, I thought, a trap. If I whistle back, I shall give my position away and shall be surrounded. I made enough noise landing to warn the entire occupation forces of our coming. But the whistle was repeated. It came from the opposite side of my little valley. There it was again, a little coy, but nevertheless clear enough. So I whistled back, and an answering whistle, definitely a friendly British whistle, came in reply. This little cross whistle act continued for some time while I lay comfortably on my back. And then the whistling drew nearer, and from the bushes and trees on the other side of the stream there emerged a small and wiry figure, that of Trooper Mickey Finn. Mickey looked a little browned off, but then that was his habit. We were very glad to see each other. Being the sensible chap he was, he had made a good landing and had already packed his kit in a little hideout of his own. He suggested we go over to his side of the valley together.
As more members of the regiment arrived via parachute over the coming days, a variety of groups established themselves in the wooded areas of central France. Their tasks, increasingly, as they found themselves better established and better armed, was to cause as much disruption to enemy forces in central France as possible. In that context, Fraser visited the scattered groups, some larger, some smaller. It was usually possible to conduct worship either on a Sunday or a weekday. When there were communicants in the camp, whatever their denomination, he would celebrate the sacrament. Normal duties of ministry also found their place. Visitation of the flock went on continually as they lived and ate and drank and travelled together. There were always the casualties to be called on, in some cases the victims of accident or engagement with the enemy. They were often cared for in improvised maquis hospitals, well served by a brilliant French doctor under the assumed name of Martel, who had joined the resistance. Within an approximate area of 100 square miles, Harry, Fraser's close protection, and the Padre were constantly on the move, doing their best to spend at least some time with every group within their reach. The life we led together made it easy for me to pray with and for my companions, and it made it hard for me to say anything concerning the Christian faith of which I was not myself utterly convinced. In a setting which could not have been more abnormal, I found opportunities to exercise my calling as great as I have ever known.
We had landed on a Thursday morning, and when Sunday came, I wondered if it would be possible to have a service. I wasn't left to wonder long. Everybody took it for granted that there would be a service. My hamper containing our church had been safely recovered from the parachutage. With the help of 2 panniers, we had a communion table, and when the cloth and cross were added, it focused worship quite effectively. In the clearing near the campfire, we met for our first act of worship. Everybody came, and everybody seemed glad to come. There were few of the usual accompaniments of worship. We were our own organ and choir. The men gathered round in a half circle in shirt sleeves or jumping smocks. They squatted on the ground for the lesson and the address. They stood for the hymns and for the prayers. Few of these men I knew were regular churchgoers. Few of them, in different circumstances, would have gone on their own accord to worship God. All that was undeniably true. It was just as true that in this forest glade, they were finding the activity of worship the most natural thing in the world. In varying degree, we were all homesick and sometimes afraid. But these men were not cowards. It was not simply to curry favor that they stood before God. The life we had begun to lead together tested our sense of values. The ambitions and worries that loomed so large in more normal conditions shrank out of all recognition, and the deep, basic needs of man, no longer overlaid by social custom and convention, stood revealed. Because one of these needs is the need of God. And there was no feeling of strangeness as we stood together and said together our Lord's Prayer. The sense of oneness our outlaw state had given us was a sense of oneness, too, with our common Father.
As men draw closer to one another, they draw closer to God. We acknowledged his love and power in the works of nature, in the green earth that was our couch each night, in the tall trees that lifted our eyes to the heavens, in the clear water that supplied our needs, in the skies through which we had traveled safely, in the loyalty of the good friends we had found. We commended our enterprise and our comrades to his keeping, our loved ones to his care. We asked forgiveness and the skill and courage we should need. The forest was very still and green and fresh after the night's rain. the smell of pine wooden logs burning slowly on the campfire was the incense that rose with our prayers. No man-made house of God could compare with the tracery of the leaves above us. The benediction was pronounced, the hymn books were collected and carefully packed in the hamper with the altar cloth and the oak cross. Men drifted off to clean their weapons or prepare the lunch. We had renewed our strength. We had waited on God.
Though in a permanently perilous situation, there were moments, lighter moments, to be savoured. We had a great reception when we reached the village. We had 7 jeeps to our name and twice as many requisitioned private cars of every type and colour. We had brought our artillery with us too, and the 26-pounders made an impressive addition to the convoy. We were all clad basically, at least in battle dress, but parachute scarves and shirts and some very odd headgear added a good deal of colour. However, what really intrigued the villagers was the fact that our squadron commander, Bill Fraser, was wearing his Gordon kilt. In the excitement aroused by this phenomenon, jeeps, 6-pounders were quite forgotten. Bill was the most modest of men, and the experience of being a celebrity was not at all to his liking, but had he known, it was much worse was to come. The morning after our arrival, the mayor announced that our little force was to be publicly welcomed in the village square, and that all would be enchanted if Monsieur le Commandant would make a short speech in French. Bill was a man of few words, even in his own language, and when it came to French, he was almost inarticulate. But his appearance on the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville, complete with kilt and Glengarry, rendered any speaking quite superfluous. He got as far as saying that he was not accustomed to making speeches in French, and the remaining part of his discourse was lost in prolonged and deafening cheers.
Some 3 months after the landing, and following the progress from the breakout in Normandy from the D-Day landings, the progression of the war, one SAS, or C Squadron, who Fraser was serving with, were relieved in place. They were sent back to the UK and given leave. That, of course, was most welcome. But Fraser also noted that he and others had quite a sense of missing the camaraderie that they'd established in those 3 remarkable months in France. There was a sense of they wanted to be back, or needed to be back. When in time they did redeploy to mainland Europe, the role of the unit was very different, taking its place or part in the liberation of Holland, Belgium, and eventually fighting its way into Germany. The warfare was brutal, attritional, much more spread out, a different dynamic from the small cohesive experiences of France. It would also include the discovery of the Nazi concentration camps. Fraser would later reflect on the challenges that that stage of the war brought to his colleagues.
The more deeply we penetrated German soil, the more tragic the conflict appeared. Nothing I had seen of the results of bombing prepared me for the devastation we now encountered. Towns have been obliterated without one landmark left. The plight of such inhabitants as remained was pathetic beyond words. As a chaplain and a German speaker, I acted as an unofficial public relations officer so far as the non-fraternization policy permitted. There was an endless list of requests for permission of one kind or another, and endless requests for help, usually beyond our power to give. Constantly, there was the temptation to loot, and for some of our men at least, it was too strong to resist. Warehouses and shops and factories had been abandoned, I suppose they thought the goods were going a-begging. If they didn't help themselves, somebody else would. And were the Germans to blame for it all anyway? Look at what they'd done to London and Coventry, Clyde Bank. Look what they'd done to our own men captured in France. It was understandable, no doubt, but no less saddening. The dangers of the campaign as a guerrilla minority in France had seemed to bring out the best in almost everyone. Now, as a tiny part of a mighty force, which we knew would soon have Germany at its mercy, the quality of our soldiering, the quality of our living, was menaced as never before.
With VE Day, 8th of May, the unit was in Germany, but shortly thereafter, and I think probably to the relief of Fraser, they were sent on to Norway, where at the time there was uncertainty as to whether the considerable number of German troops there would surrender. As it happened, they did. Fraser concluded on that chapter. My time in Norway was broken in very happy fashion while I was there. Our second child, Kenneth, arrived in Edinburgh, and Colonel Padre granted me special paternity leave. Had the war with Japan gone on longer, we would have found ourselves in Asia. A number of plans were discussed for the deployment of the SAS brigade at some strategic point, perhaps on the borders of India and China. Before such plans could be finished, the war was over and demobilization had begun. The University of Glasgow had applied for my release, but there was still one task which I very much wanted to undertake. When we left for France, we were able to give our next of kin only the haziest idea of where we were going and what we hoped to do. In the case of those who were killed, the relatives were waiting anxiously for as much information as we could give them. With the Colonel's approval, and frequently with the aid of his Humber staff car, I covered many hundreds of miles to meet wives and parents and give them some idea of the circumstances in which their husbands and sons had died. When meetings were impossible, I wrote as fully as I could, but letters are a poor substitute for question and answer face to face. We conclude this afternoon with two verdicts. The verdict of the men about their Padre, and the verdict of the Padre about the men. Fraser McCluskey was simply the best Padre the first SAS could have had at that time. He was and is admired and loved by all who served with him or who have known him since. He is a big, impressive man, quiet and kindly in manner, with a wonderful sense of humor, who understood and listened to his disparate flock of warriors, never forgetting the name of a spouse or child. When he parachuted unarmed into France, he carried a wooden cross, now displayed in the regimental chapel at Hereford, and an altar cloth in a suitcase. Avoiding discovery, he made the rounds of our operational groups to hold services attended always by everyone in the various wooded locations. Often he avoided trouble by a hair's breadth. He visited our wounded wherever they were being secretly cared for. In thus devotedly discharging his pastoral duties in enemy territory, he was also a wonderful source of information. For all this, he was rightly awarded a military cross and croix de guerre.
Looking back on this first meeting with my new and unorthodox congregation, I find it hard to convey the impression they made on me. Like their Padre, they were not without their faults, but their faults, unlike the virtues of some, were easy to live with. They could be irresponsible with property and with money, due in part perhaps to their training and special role. They could sit lightly to the conventions and even the laws of society. Learning to live dangerously had weakened the sanctions of the normal, So the tension of insecurity found their weak spots less readily than the relaxation which returning safety brought with it. It's hard to live in two worlds by one rule. And where these men failed, none of us wholly succeeds. It must be admitted that at unit celebrations, too much drink was consumed too often by too few. It must, on the other hand, be claimed that these parties were themselves the product of a fellowship that was genuine and sincere. A fellowship that is in our reunions still.
My men were not on the whole keen churchmen. When there was a church parade, they were glad enough to come. I found them easy to talk to and easy to lead in worship. There was respect for the church and little, if any, opposition. But many of these men were living their lives outside the fellowship and discipline of Christian worship. Much of the vocabulary of Christian thought and worship was meaningless to them. Army service had brought them within the orbit of the Christian church and given both them and the church an opportunity. What would they make of the opportunity? And what would the church make of it?
Generalizations are notoriously dangerous, and it was not in any case of such abstractions as attitudes to religion or church that I found myself thinking. In these first few months in my new parish, I thought rather of Padre and Mike, of Bill and John, of Malcolm and Hamish, of Gordon and Jock. I thought of individual men among the officers, the NCOs, and the men who had proved their courage and their skill in the strange new world of war. Men who had given me so quickly and so freely their trust and their friendship. Pride in that gift has not lessened, I suppose. There is nothing I value more. I had never lived with such a group of men before, nor do I expect to do so again. It was easy to be brave in their company and difficult to be a coward. I know that I shall never wholly lose the infection of their courage and good cheer.
Friends, that concludes our presentation, but it would be a pleasure to ask Andrew perhaps to come and either to offer a few words or certainly maybe to take a question or two. And we're just going to get him mic'd up.
Where shall I?
Andrew,
In the
wherever
middle.
you'd like.
Gosh, very well. This is strong stuff. Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much. Could I just very briefly put a small picture of my mum beside Dad's?
Of course.
I'll talk about it in a minute. Yeah. Oh, here we are. There we are. Behind every great man.
Andrew, are you going to speak?
Yeah,
or
sure.
Yes,
now,
please.
Do you want me to speak a bit or answer questions, or you're the boss?
How is the Spirit moving you? Would you like to speak, or are you ready for some questions?
I'm ready for questions. Shall I say a few words?
Please.
And then open to questions. And if people are not then completely overtaxed, I can say a bit more. I was trained as a teacher. I'm a clergyman like yourself. And shutting me up probably could be difficult. So, can I say a few words? And then I'll open to questions. So, first of all, thank you, Angus. Thank you, David, for a very, indeed, yeah, a very reverent and interesting rendition of Dad's book and other texts. I have to say, I wondered at first if you were Bill Nye, but do people confuse
Am I supposed to be pleased by that?
But we've got you instead, and I'm sure that's just as good. I'm sure Bill would have been excellent, but you're wonderful. There we are. Anyway, no, a great joy to be here. I used to sit in the front row with my brother Kenneth, who unfortunately can't be with us. He's in Dunfermline, not drinking the blood red wine, but being in a dorm there. But it is a great joy to be back in this wonderful church with some folk who I know, and some folk who probably remember me, much smaller and perhaps even more out of order than I am now. Dad was a fine man. I mean, this has come over, that's why you're here, isn't it? He was a fine man. He was a fine minister. And he was a fine father. That latter point is relevant because, as he would be the first to admit, and in his book points out that my dear mum, like so many women, and it is a gender thing, had the really hard time. Yes, Dad and his friends were under threat of one kind or another. Some of them died or were caught by the Gestapo, of course. But the constant day-to-day worry must have been so wearing. I'm a mere male, but, it was coupled for Mum, and to some extent for Dad, by the death of Joan, my sister, who I never knew. She died of meningitis while Dad was serving. So I remember Mum, and sadly she died many years ago. But also, of course, she was German. She was the daughter of a German pastor, very much an anti-Nazi pastor in the town of Wuppertal. Maybe some of you have heard about the Schwebebahn, the overhead railway that plies there. And Mum was a remarkable woman, it was much missed. So when we came down here in 1960, gosh, that's a long time ago. I don't know what Bill Nye was doing there. David was perhaps just training for the stage then or something, I don't know.
In 1960?
Yeah.
I was 13.
13? Oh, people used to be at work at that stage. And Angus, you were hardly in someone's eye then, but anyway. But 1960 we came down, and sadly by that time Mum had passed away. But Dad, Kenneth, and me, and Sam, I have brought a picture of Sam. I can show it privately to you afterwards. Our Labrador, great chap. We settled actually in a hotel for a while because the manse, and of course there have been several manses in just around the corner, wasn't ready. So we were in a hotel for a while. But we came down, and then Dad got into the way of the work here. Kenneth and I went to school, and then went our own ways. But he was a fine man. He was a fine minister. He really had all the skills like your present minister. A preacher, a pastor. And those were the two things that he said were his aims. When I was studying for the ministry myself, quite a long time later than that, I asked him, what's the essence of preaching? And I don't know whether Angus has come across this one. He said, preach about God and preach about 15 minutes. And I've always tried to imitate that, particularly on the 15 minutes, Simon, so that maybe gives you a bit of hope that I won't be here too long. But it's important, I think, also, and, being the son, and my brother Ken, I think, would say the same, of a very distinguished gentleman, some might say a great man, probably the same with a great woman, has its upside and downside. Think of Randolph Churchill, perhaps. It's not always the easiest thing. But Dad was a very good father, and although we heard about the war, the SAS and all that, it certainly wasn't thrust down our throat. He was a good man, he was a good minister, a good father, and certainly my teenage years spent very much around here, Scottish country dancing and school with the church orchestra were great times. So, in many ways one feels unworthy when you hear the wonderful stories, not just about Dad, but Padre and his colleagues. They were a great generation. And I give thanks to the London Scots. I give tribute to the London Scots and any officers they have here for the excellent work that you've done, not just today, although it's been brilliant with the pipes and drums and everything, but remembering the contribution that London Scots made, both from London, in London, but also HLI and the Gordons and all that elsewhere. So I think that's really all I want to say is by way of peroration. But if anyone has any questions that you think I might answer, hello, sir.
I served in the SAS, and I actually met your father.
Great.
And I've actually got the book here, which he has signed.
Yes.
I'll get you to sign it later as well, if I may.
My goodness. Well, I can, yeah.
What an amazing man he was. And he was, what I loved about him, you've touched on, was his gentleness. Yes. Now, I had an uncle who was also a Padre in the Second World War. Yeah. And he had that same demeanour, that gentleness and kindness, which I can feel to this day. I actually asked your dad if he would take my funeral service. Now, I mean, you know, at that time it was kind of pretty unrealistic. Yeah. But I was so impressed, and I came to this church many times when he was preaching as well. So it's so nice to meet you. Wonderful.
Very nice to meet you, sir. Can I ask your name?
Evan Parsons.
Edward.
Evan. The Welsh, not the Scottish.
Evan. Say no more. And I see the badge and everything there. Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks so much. At the back, sir. Yes. Sorry, sir, you'll have to repeat that. Just
right, come up here.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
I said, where was your father born and brought up, and where did he go to school? Can you just tell us a wee bit about his early life?
And where did he go to school? Yeah. And where did I go to school, Peter? Thank you for that, Michael. Dad, this should be Hugh doing this. He does this for money, doesn't he? But so where was Dad's early year? Born, marriage, birth. Dad was born in 1914. A key year, the year the war broke out, the First World War broke out, and other people want to speak. That's all right. Don't worry. Dad was born in 1914 in Edinburgh. His father was a laundryman. He ran a laundry business, first in Edinburgh and then Aberdeen. And Dad went to school at Aberdeen Grammar School and did well. Left at 16, like Gordon Brown, another famous Scotsman. But they were difficult years. This was the years of the Depression. No welfare state, no university grants or anything. And the business that Grandad, who was a very nice man, ran, went bust. A lot of businesses went bust at that time. And this had its impact, I think, on the marriage, sadly. Anyway, the family moved down, or certainly Grandma and Dad and his sister moved down to Edinburgh because they'd lost their home, as I understand it, and a relative made it possible for Grandma to set up a sort of boarding house for students in Priestfield Road in Edinburgh. And Dad then went to the university at the tender age of 16, got an MA, because he'd won a Carnegie scholarship. There was no grants or anything, you had to win scholarships. And then, feeling the call to ministry, the Kirk, bless it, gave him a scholarship, a grant to study at New College for the ministry. So, is that okay sort of thing so far? Yeah. Anything else?
Andrew, sorry, can you just hold for a moment?
Excellent.
Yeah. We'll take 2 more questions, and then there's a bit of opportunity of book purchasing, or say the more remote. But Andrew, if there are 2 more, just conscious of time.
Young man here.
Would it be possible to come to the microphone, then everyone gets to hear the question?
I just wanted to ask you, Andrew, where your mum and dad met.
My mum.
Where your mum and dad met.
Where they met?
Yes.
Well, romantic, dramatic there, and interesting. And please ask more. But yes, very briefly, and it was exciting. I got Dad to New College, didn't I, in the 1930s, and he did his studies there and got his BD. At the termination of his course, and I have to explain this, he was offered a scholarship to go to Germany where in the late 30s there was a section of the church, the Protestant church, called the Bekennende Kirche, the confessing church, which refused to kowtow to Hitler, and because Hitler was trying to remold the church in his own sort of design. And Dad was sent to do some study of this. So he, in daring McCluskey fashion, he didn't know much German at that point. He got on train, ended up in Wuppertal, where he'd been given the address of a minister who might put him up and sort of was sympathetic to this. And this minister, Paul Humburg, actually a very distinguished German anti-Nazi pastor, said, "Fraser McCluskey, you do not know any German. You must learn German. As it happens, my niece," ears will pick up, "my niece teaches German to foreigners at the local Berlitz school. I recommend you go there." So Dad went and enrolled, and of course, as you've already guessed, the teacher was my mum. Irene, mother, she was slightly older than him. She'd had to leave school pretty early because there was no money for university or anything. She had been an au pair in England, Switzerland, all over the place, had got perfect English, and she was a natural teacher, but they also fell in love. Very difficult because war was on the horizon, Mum was very torn. I mean, she was in love with Dad, I know, but very torn. They could both see it. Anyway, slowly, they decided, yeah, Mum would go back with Dad to England, well, Scotland, actually, of course. And fortunately, Dad already got a job at Glasgow University, but it was hugely difficult. She was leaving her kith and kin, and sadly, they were all killed in an English bombing raid, British bombing raid at the end of the war. Not Mum, but her parents. But anyway, so yeah, there you are. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you very much.
So it sounds as though we could get one more. Okay. I think we've answered everything. But anyway.
Paul, if I could go on mine. Thank you very much.
That's fine. Thank you so much.
Andrew, on behalf of our gathering, friends, before departure, towards the back of the, just by the bookstall, there are available 2 timely publications. There is Damien's book, SAS Daggers Drawn, has significant references to Fraser in it, and a very warm tribute to him. So do have a look at that. Scots in London at the panel discussions last Tuesday at London Scottish House, Professor Lucy Noakes has produced a wonderful kind of social history specifically around the memoirs of VE Day, the original day, from the People's Mass Observation Resources. So there's a kind of fascinating treasure trove of accounts of the time. So do look out for those. Jenny, I think, and Hugh maybe are looking after the bookstall at the back. Again, on behalf of you all, thank you very much to our guest reader, to David. And one concluding part of today, really from leftover from this morning, any of our diplomatic representatives, if you would be happy just to stay behind for a moment, we might require a photo of you. You know who you are, I think. I can't quite see who, but the request is that. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming and enjoy the afternoon.